She had planned 300 weddings before her own, and never once imagined this is how hers would end. Vivian Sinclair stood at the altar of St. Michael's, holding a single folded note, and for the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing rehearsed to say. Behind her, 300 guests waited for 2 words. In front of her stood the man she had promised herself to 9 months earlier, watching the color drain from her face as she read something he never meant for her eyes. Somewhere between the doors opening and this moment, everything Vivian believed about her fiancé, her family, and the man standing across from her had quietly come undone. What she was holding in her hand would end a wedding, expose a secret 15 years old, and force an entire city to ask the same question you are about to ask yourself. What would you do if the man you loved turned out to be someone else entirely? Before we go further, there are 3 questions this story will answer, and each one matters more than the last. Who wrote the note that stopped a Charleston wedding in front of 300 witnesses? What confession could possibly be hidden inside 4 handwritten paragraphs? And why did it take 15 years for the truth to reach the one woman who deserved to hear it first? For now, know only this. Vivian Sinclair and Julian Hale were, by every outward measure, the golden couple of Charleston society that spring, admired at every dinner party, photographed at every gala, envied by friends who had no idea what either family was quietly carrying. And on the morning of the wedding, Vivian's closest friend, Dana Whitfield, would later admit she saw Julian's own brother slip into the bride's dressing room only minutes before the ceremony began, carrying something in his jacket pocket he was never invited to bring. 18 months earlier, Vivian Sinclair was already well known throughout Charleston, though not for anything to do with weddings that were her own. She spent her days building other people's love stories into something worth remembering, choosing flowers, timing toasts, smoothing over the small disasters no guest ever sees. What almost no one knew was how carefully she avoided her own past while doing it. Her father, Walter Sinclair, had died 5 years earlier, and with him went an unspoken agreement inside the family that his old construction business was simply not a subject anyone brought up at dinner. Vivian had grown up believing that silence was grief. She had no reason yet to imagine it might be something closer to guilt, carefully managed for over a decade by people who loved her enough to keep her from ever asking the wrong question out loud. She met Julian Hale on a humid April evening at a charity gala, benefiting historic preservation, the kind of event where old Charleston families still measured each other by which century their money came from. Julian introduced himself with an easy, unhurried charm, the sort that made a room feel smaller and warmer at the same time. He was 35, sharp in conversation, and successful in real estate development, though he deflected every question about his own family with a practiced lightness Vivian mistook, at the time, for simple modesty. What she noticed instead was how often he steered their conversation back to her father's old construction company, asking questions that seemed casual, almost too specific to be idle curiosity. Questions she answered without a second thought, because nobody had asked about Walter Sinclair's business in years, and it felt, strangely, like being seen. By the 3rd date, Julian Hale had become the kind of presence Vivian hadn't allowed into her life since before her father passed. He remembered small details she mentioned only once. He showed up early, never late, and never made her feel like the demanding schedule of a wedding planner was a burden to work around. Friends began asking when they'd see a ring. Her mother, still fragile since Walter's death, seemed lighter every time Julian's name came up at Sunday dinner. And yet, in the background of all this warmth was a man quietly noticing every silence around the Sinclair name, filing away every detail Vivian offered freely, in a courtship whose true starting point began not the night they met, but years before, in a version of Julian's life she knew almost nothing about. Before we go any further into what Vivian didn't yet know, let us pause here for a moment, because this is exactly the kind of decision so many of us face without ever realizing it. Trusting someone with our heart means trusting a version of their past we can never fully verify, taking their silences as privacy instead of concealment, their deflections as modesty instead of design. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what Vivian was about to build her life on was not simply a romance. It was a foundation neither of them had been honest about, one built quietly, brick by brick, long before she ever said yes. It was Dana Whitfield, Vivian's closest friend since their college years at the College of Charleston, who first said out loud what everyone else seemed too polite to mention. Dana had watched Julian charm an entire room without ever once mentioning his own father, without ever bringing Vivian to visit the modest house where his mother, Eleanor Hale, still lived alone. When Dana finally asked Vivian directly whether she found any of it strange, Vivian laughed it off, insisting that grief simply looked different in every family, that not everyone processed loss the way the Sinclairs did, loudly avoiding it at every dinner table. Dana let it go that night, though she would later admit she had never quite believed her own reassurance, and had simply not yet found the words to explain what, exactly, felt rehearsed about a man who otherwise seemed too good to be true. Vivian's own mother, still healing in her own quiet way from Walter's death, welcomed Julian into their lives with a relief that was almost visible, the relief of a widow who had spent years worrying her daughter would never let anyone close enough to matter again. She hosted him for Sunday dinners, laughed at his jokes about Charleston traffic, and told Vivian more than once that her father would have liked him, a comment that meant more to Vivian than almost anything else anyone said that year, and one that would return to her later with a very different weight once she understood exactly how much Julian already knew about the father he was supposedly earning approval from. Vivian brushed off Dana's warning the way she brushed off most warnings that spring, certain that whatever ghosts Julian carried were his to share when he was ready, certain that love this steady could not possibly be built on anything false. She had no idea, walking home that night with his jacket still around her shoulders, that the man she was falling for already knew exactly who her father was, exactly what Walter Sinclair's company had done 15 years earlier, and exactly how much it had cost the Hale family to survive it. She had no idea that his interest in her was never an accident at all. The year that followed moved the way whirlwind years often do in hindsight, fast enough that neither of them stopped to examine the parts that didn't quite fit. Julian proposed on a Sunday evening in autumn, on the same wraparound porch where they'd shared their first real conversation, and Vivian said yes, without hesitation, certain that whatever uncertainty life had handed her since her father's death, this at least was solid ground. Their engagement announcement ran in the Charleston papers within the week. Two respected family names joined together, though only one of those families seemed genuinely pleased about the match. Vivian noticed it first at the engagement dinner, in the careful, unreadable politeness of Julian's mother, Eleanor Hale, a woman whose warmth never quite reached her eyes whenever the Sinclair name was mentioned at the table. Eleanor Hale was, by every account, a gracious hostess, the kind of Southern mother who complimented a dress before finding a way to mention everything wrong with the wedding budget. But her politeness toward Vivian had a particular edge to it, a formality that never once softened into affection, even after months of holiday dinners and family gatherings. When Vivian tried, gently, to ask about Julian's father, Eleanor would change the subject with practiced ease, mentioning the weather, the wine, anything but the man who had died when Julian was only 17. Vivian assumed, as she had assumed about so much that year, that grief simply wore different faces in different families, and told herself Eleanor would warm to her eventually, once enough time had passed to prove her intentions were genuine. There were other small things too, easy enough to explain away individually, harder to ignore once they began adding up. Julian kept a drawer in his home office, locked at all times, a detail Vivian noticed only because she once reached for a stapler and found it wouldn't open. When she asked about it, lightly, teasing him about old college secrets, he laughed and said it was just paperwork from a development deal, nothing interesting, and changed the subject before she could ask again. There were also the calls from his brother, Marcus, always late at night, always ending abruptly the moment Vivian walked into the room, Julian's voice dropping into something clipped and careful that never matched the easy warmth he showed her otherwise. She told herself brothers had their own history, their own shorthand, and that it was none of her business to intrude on it. And yet, for every small crack Vivian noticed and set aside, there were 100 moments that felt entirely real, undeniably so. Julian showed up at her mother's hospital bedside during a minor scare without being asked twice. He learned to make her grandmother's shrimp and grits recipe from memory after watching her cook it only once. He held her through the anniversary of her father's death every year without needing to be told what day it was. Whatever else was true about Julian Hale, and there was more buried beneath the surface than Vivian could have imagined, the tenderness he showed her was not performance. It was real enough that even now, knowing everything that would come later, Vivian would never be able to say the love itself had been a lie, only that it had been born from something far more complicated than either of them admitted at the time. The engagement party was held at the Hale family's modest but well-kept home, a detail Vivian found endearing rather than telling, assuming their financial caution was simply old-fashioned thrift rather than the visible scar of something they'd lost long ago. Late in the evening, looking for a pen to write a thank-you note, Vivian slipped quietly into Julian's home office, the same room with the locked drawer she had noticed a dozen times before. This time, the drawer had been left open, just barely, forgotten in the rush of hosting. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of old bills, was a yellowed newspaper clipping, brittle at the edges, clearly kept and reread many times over many years. The headline was faded, but still legible, something about a building collapse on the Charleston Peninsula more than a decade earlier, injuries, an investigation, a settlement quietly reached out of court. And there, circled in red ink, so old it had turned the color of rust, was a name Vivian knew better than any other name in the world. Her father's name, Walter Sinclair. She stood frozen in that office for a long moment, guests laughing somewhere down the hall, trying to convince herself there was an innocent explanation for why the man she was about to marry had been keeping her father's name locked in a drawer, circled like evidence, for longer than she wanted to imagine. She slipped the clipping back beneath the bills, exactly as she found it, smoothed her dress, and returned to the party with a smile that fooled everyone in the room, including herself, for a little while longer. In the weeks that followed, she told herself a dozen different stories to explain it away. Perhaps Julian had simply come across an old article about her father's company once, out of ordinary curiosity, and kept it the way people sometimes keep strange, meaningless things. She did not ask him about it directly, telling herself she would find the right moment eventually, not yet realizing that the right moment would end up choosing her instead, on the very morning she least expected it. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and unbearably ordinary, full of the small chaos every wedding day carries, regardless of what's hidden beneath it. Hair appointments ran late. A seamstress made last-minute adjustments to a hem. Dana kept everyone laughing, with stories from their college years, determined to keep Vivian's nerves from turning into anything heavier. Vivian, for her part, had long since set aside the memory of that newspaper clipping, telling herself she'd misread the moment, that Julian surely had some ordinary explanation she simply hadn't asked for yet, that today was not the day to reopen a conversation about a decade-old accident neither of them had witnessed firsthand. Across town, in a guest room at his mother's house, Julian Hale was not thinking about hairpins or seating charts. He sat alone at a small writing desk, a blank sheet of paper in front of him, for longer than he wanted to admit, before finally beginning to write, slowly, deliberately, crossing out more lines than he kept. What he was writing was never meant for Vivian's eyes at all. It was a letter to himself, the kind a person writes when they need to see their own reasoning laid out in ink to believe it's real, a confession of everything he had planned to do a year earlier, and everything he could no longer bring himself to go through with now that the plan had a face he loved. He sealed the letter into an envelope with no name written on the front, intending to burn it later, or perhaps simply to carry the weight of having written it down at all. He did not notice his brother Marcus standing quietly in the doorway, watching him seal it, watching the particular care Julian took, folding it into his jacket pocket before slipping the jacket on over his wedding shirt. Marcus said nothing in that moment. He had said very little to Julian in weeks, ever since the night Julian told him, flatly, that whatever they had once planned together was over, that he was not going through with it, that Vivian Sinclair deserved better than being a pawn in a debt that was never hers to pay. Photographs were called for an hour later, family gathering in the Hales' modest front garden for the kind of pictures that get framed and hung in hallways for decades. In the small crush of people finding their marks and adjusting ties, no one noticed Marcus step close behind his brother, reach quietly into the jacket pocket Julian had barely taken off, and slide the sealed envelope into his own coat instead. No one noticed, least of all Julian, who smiled for the camera with the particular relief of a man who believed, wrongly, that the hardest part of the morning was already behind him. By the time Vivian arrived at St. Michael's, the ceremony was less than an hour away, and the bridal suite had the particular hush that settles over a room once all the practical work is finished and there is nothing left to do but wait. Dana stepped out to check on the flowers one last time, leaving Vivian alone for the first time all morning, seated at a small dressing table in front of a mirror, veil pinned, hands finally still. It was in that quiet that a young usher knocked gently at the door, holding a plain sealed envelope, explaining only that the groom's brother had asked him to deliver it to the bride personally before the ceremony began. Vivian assumed, reasonably, that it was some small gesture from Julian, a private note grooms sometimes send before a wedding, and she opened it with the soft, unguarded smile of a woman expecting one last tender moment before walking down the aisle. What she found instead was 4 paragraphs of handwriting she recognized instantly as Julian's own, unsigned, clearly never intended for anyone else to read. She read the first line twice before her hands went still. It did not begin with her name, it began with her father's. The letter spoke of a building collapse 15 years earlier, of a man named Robert Hale who never came home from it, of a settlement quietly signed and quietly forgotten by everyone except the family left to rebuild their entire life from nothing. It spoke of a plan, conceived long before Julian ever said hello to her at that charity gala, and one single sentence near the bottom that Vivian would read over and over in the years to come. I told myself I'd walk away before it went this far, and I didn't. She sat with that sentence in her hands, veil still pinned perfectly in place, for what felt like a very long time. She had not finished reading the final paragraph when, on the other side of the door, the first notes of the wedding march began to play. 300 guests already rising to their feet, a groom already waiting at the altar, with no idea what his own brother had just placed into the hands of the woman he loved. Vivian walked down the aisle of St. Michael's with the letter folded inside her bouquet, her face composed enough that not a single guest suspected anything was wrong, though Dana, walking just ahead of her, would later say she noticed something different in the set of Vivian's shoulders, something she couldn't name until it was already too late to stop. Julian stood at the altar, exactly as he had 100 times in Vivian's imagination over the past year, and for one brief moment, watching her approach, he allowed himself to believe the letter in his jacket pocket, wherever it had ended up, no longer mattered at all. When Vivian reached the altar, she did not take his hands the way they had rehearsed. Instead, she reached into her bouquet, pulled out the folded letter, and unfolded it slowly enough that the entire front row could see exactly what she was holding. She read one line aloud, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, the same line that had stopped her cold in the dressing suite only minutes earlier. "I told myself I'd walk away before it went this far, and I didn't." She watched Julian's face change in real time, confusion sharpening into recognition, recognition collapsing into something that looked, to everyone watching, very much like horror. A low murmur moved through the guests like wind through tall grass. 300 people trying to understand what they were witnessing, without yet having any of the details that would make sense of it. Eleanor Hale, seated in the front row, went pale in a way that told everyone paying close attention that whatever this letter was, she already knew exactly what it meant. Near the back of the church, Marcus Hale rose quietly from his seat and began moving toward the side exit, his expression unreadable, his exit unnoticed by everyone except his own mother, who watched him go with an expression somewhere between grief and fury. Julian stepped forward, close enough to speak only to Vivian, and asked for the one thing he had no right to ask for anymore. 5 minutes, he said, just 5 minutes alone, to explain everything the letter didn't say. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, then turned instead to face the entire congregation, 300 faces waiting for her answer. "You can have your 5 minutes," she said, loud enough for every pew to hear. "But you'll have them right here, in front of everyone, because I am done being the only person in this church who doesn't know the whole story." To understand what Julian was about to confess in front of 300 wedding guests, it helps to go back 15 years, to a spring afternoon on the Charleston Peninsula when a commercial renovation project, overseen by Walter Sinclair's construction company, was nearing the final stage of a contract that had already run well over budget and well behind schedule. The building belonged to the Hale family, a modest but respected name in Charleston's small business community, and the renovation was meant to expand a storefront that had supported 3 generations of the family before Robert Hale ever inherited it. According to records that would later surface in a sealed civil settlement, corners had been cut in the renovation's structural work, cheaper materials substituted without the knowledge of the Hale family, inspections signed off on faster than the work itself could reasonably support. When a spring storm rolled through the peninsula that April, bringing heavier winds than the building's compromised framework could withstand, part of the structure gave way during business hours, while Robert Hale himself was inside checking on the progress of the very same renovation that would end his life within the hour. Robert Hale died from injuries sustained in the collapse, leaving behind a wife, Eleanor, and 2 sons, Julian, 17 at the time, and Marcus, only 14. What followed was not the public reckoning the Hale family expected, but something quieter and, in its own way, crueler. Walter Sinclair's company reached a private settlement with the family within months, a settlement that came with a confidentiality agreement attached, keeping the details out of the local papers and out of any public record beyond a brief, forgettable notice of an accident under investigation. The settlement was enough to keep the Hale family from losing everything outright, but not nearly enough to rebuild the life they had before the collapse. Vivian, meanwhile, grew up on the other side of that same settlement, believing only that her father had been involved in some kind of accident at work, one he never discussed, one that seemed to age him overnight, one the family simply agreed, without ever saying so out loud, not to bring up. She had no idea, all those years, that on the other side of Charleston, a widow and two young sons were living with the daily, visible cost of an accident her father's silence had helped bury. Julian was 17 when he stood at his father's funeral, old enough to understand exactly what had happened and old enough to remember, with total clarity, the single moment during the civil proceedings when he first saw Walter Sinclair's face across a courtroom gallery, composed, apologetic, and utterly protected by the settlement his lawyers had negotiated. Julian would carry that image for the next 15 years, through his mother's slow decline in health, through the sale of the family's home, through his brother Marcus abandoning his own college plans to help keep the family afloat, long before he ever learned Vivian Sinclair's name. What Julian did not fully understand, standing in that courtroom gallery at 17, was how completely his own life would eventually intersect with hers, or how many years it would take before he found himself close enough to the Sinclair family to do something about the grievance he had carried since childhood. That intersection, and the plan it eventually produced, would not begin to take shape until Julian was nearly 30 years old, working in real estate development and searching, almost obsessively, for any information he could find about what had become of Walter Sinclair's only daughter. He found her, eventually, through nothing more dramatic than a mutual friend's wedding, where her name appeared on a vendor list as the event's planner. He recognized the surname immediately, and in that instant, 15 years of carefully contained grief finally had somewhere to go. The settlement itself, when Julian finally obtained a copy of it years later, through a records request Marcus filed under his own name, was almost clinically brief for something that had reshaped two families so completely. It listed a dollar figure, a confidentiality clause, and a single paragraph acknowledging, without ever using the word fault, that certain materials used in the renovation had not met the standard originally specified in the contract. There was no admission of wrongdoing, no apology, nothing that resembled the kind of accountability Julian had spent his teenage years imagining he was owed. Reading it for the first time, alone in his apartment, was the moment he later described as the true beginning of the plan, long before he ever learned Vivian's name. To understand what that grief actually cost the Hale family, it helps to look past the settlement itself and toward everything that settlement failed to cover. The construction business Robert Hale had inherited from his own father closed within 2 years of his death, unable to survive both the loss of its founder and the reputational damage of being associated, however unfairly, with the collapse that killed him. Eleanor Hale, left to manage a business she had never been trained to run, sold what remained of the company for far less than it was worth, simply to keep the family afloat through the following winter. The family home, a modest but beloved property that had been in the Hale family for 2 generations, was sold not long after, replaced by a smaller rental Eleanor never grew to think of as home. Marcus, only 14 when his father died, watched his mother's health decline steadily over the following decade, the kind of slow deterioration doctors attribute to stress as often as to age. By the time Marcus turned 18, the college fund his parents had built for him since infancy had been quietly redirected toward medical bills and legal fees neither of his parents ever anticipated needing. Marcus deferred his own education indefinitely to help support the household, taking work wherever he could find it, watching his older brother Julian eventually escape into a career in real estate development, while he himself remained tethered to Charleston, to their mother's care, to a grievance he had far less opportunity than Julian did to ever set down. It was Marcus, not Julian, who first began quietly compiling records related to the settlement, the collapse, and Walter Sinclair's company, years before Julian ever mentioned Vivian's name to him. On the other side of Charleston, the Sinclair family's version of the same decade looked entirely different. The settlement, along with Walter Sinclair's continued, quiet success in the construction industry, allowed Vivian and her mother to remain in the same comfortable home, to send Vivian to a respected university, to build the kind of stable, unremarkable life that never once forced anyone in the family to reckon publicly with what the company's shortcuts had actually cost someone else. Vivian never knew any of this contrast existed because no one in her family ever gave her reason to look for it. It would be easy, from the outside, to cast this story as one family's villainy against another family's innocence. But the truth Julian eventually had to reckon with was messier than that. Walter Sinclair had never faced criminal charges, in part because negligence proven after the fact is rarely simple to prove beyond doubt in a courtroom, and in part because the settlement itself made a longer legal fight financially impossible for a grieving widow with 2 young sons to sustain. Neither family, in the years that followed, ever fully understood the other's version of what those 15 years had cost. What Julian did not know, even as he began quietly courting Vivian Sinclair years later, was that his younger brother had never stopped keeping a file on the Sinclair family, updated over the years with newspaper clippings, court documents obtained through public record requests, and eventually, once Julian's relationship with Vivian became serious, notes on the wedding itself. Julian only discovered the full extent of that file the morning of his own wedding, when Marcus finally showed him what 15 years of quiet resentment had built, one page at a time. Marcus would later describe those years to anyone who asked as a kind of slow accounting, one he kept mostly for himself, tallying every hospital bill against every article he found celebrating Walter Sinclair's continued success in Charleston's construction industry. He never once told his mother he was keeping the file, aware that Eleanor had made her own peace, however incomplete, with simply moving forward. He told only Julian, the summer both brothers turned old enough to understand exactly what their family had lost. And it was Julian, not Marcus, who first suggested that peace was not the only option still available to them. Standing at the altar, 5 minutes granted to him in front of the very guests he had once imagined would witness a very different kind of ceremony, Julian Hale finally told the truth he had spent a year building a life around avoiding. He admitted that his interest in Vivian Sinclair had never begun as an accident at all. Nearly 2 years before their first real conversation, Julian and Marcus had discovered, through a mutual acquaintance's wedding, that Walter Sinclair's daughter had grown up to become a well-known event planner in Charleston society, unmarried, well-connected, and entirely unaware of who her father's old company had once destroyed. The plan the brothers built together in the months that followed was, by Julian's own admission at the altar, both simple and cruel in its precision. Julian would court Vivian deliberately, win her trust, become close enough to her family and her social circle to be trusted completely, and then, on the day of their wedding, in front of everyone who mattered to Charleston society, reveal the truth about Walter Sinclair's company and the settlement that had quietly protected his reputation for 15 years. It was meant to be a public reclaiming of everything the Hale name had lost, delivered at the exact moment the Sinclair name stood proudest. For the first several months of courting Vivian, Julian later admitted, the plan proceeded exactly as designed. He found it easy to make her laugh, easy to remember the details she mentioned only once, easy to let her believe his attentiveness was simple affection rather than careful strategy. What he had not planned for, and what he insisted, standing at that altar, changed everything, was how quickly his own feelings for her stopped being part of the plan and started being simply real, in a way neither Marcus nor Julian himself had anticipated when they first sat down together to design the whole arrangement. By the time Julian proposed, he told the guests he had already spent months trying to find a way out of the plan without confessing to it outright, hoping some quieter resolution might present itself, some way to simply let the grievance dissolve without ever forcing Vivian to learn how it began. He described sleepless nights spent trying to write down, in private, exactly what he owed his father's memory versus what he owed the woman he had genuinely come to love. A conflict he admitted he never fully resolved, only postponed, again and again, until the morning of the wedding forced his hand. And then Julian said the line that changed the entire shape of the story, for everyone standing in that church, guests included. He had, he told them, already destroyed the evidence weeks earlier. The documents Marcus had spent years compiling, the settlement paperwork, the court records, everything that would have made the planned exposure at the reception possible, Julian had quietly gathered and burned in his own fireplace one night in early spring, telling no one, not even Marcus, that the plan they had built together for over a year was already dead before the wedding invitations were even printed. Julian went on to describe, in front of everyone, exactly how carefully the first months of courtship had been engineered, admitting that he had chosen the charity gala where they met because he knew, through a mutual acquaintance, that Vivian would be attending and had arranged to be introduced through a friend of a friend, rather than approach her directly, precisely so nothing about their meeting would look deliberate later. He admitted to memorizing details about her father's company before their first real conversation, so that his questions that night would sound like natural curiosity rather than the research they actually were, a level of premeditation that visibly unsettled even some of Julian's own relatives seated among the guests. The murmur that moved through the congregation after that admission was louder than the one before it, guests turning to whisper to one another, trying to understand how a plan this elaborate could have been quietly dismantled by one of its own architects, without the other ever knowing. Eleanor Hale sat perfectly still in the front pew, her expression unreadable, caught somewhere between relief that her sons had not gone through with the public humiliation of the Sinclair name, and grief that her husband's memory had, in the end, been set aside by the very son who once seemed most determined to honor it. It was Marcus who spoke next, stepping forward from where he had been standing near the side exit, his voice carrying none of his brother's practiced calm. He confirmed, in front of everyone, that he had been the one to slip into Vivian's dressing room that morning, and the one to intercept the sealed letter from Julian's jacket during the family photographs. He had read it privately before delivering it, he admitted, and made the deliberate choice to place it in Vivian's hands rather than destroy it, precisely because he had no intention of letting his brother's private reckoning replace the public one he still believed the Sinclair family owed them. Marcus explained that he had never agreed with Julian's decision to abandon the plan and had, in fact, spent the weeks since discovering that decision growing increasingly convinced that Julian's newfound love for Vivian had made him weak in exactly the way their father would never have forgiven. Where Julian saw a chance at genuine happiness worth protecting, Marcus saw 15 years of his mother's declining health, his own unfinished education, and a family name quietly erased from Charleston's memory, all of it about to be forgiven, simply because his brother had fallen in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time. Eleanor Hale, watching her two sons stand at opposite ends of the same altar, seemed for a long moment unable to choose which grief to attend to first, her surviving son's fury or her late husband's memory, both of them somehow tangled together in a way 15 years had never managed to untangle. She rose slowly from the front pew, moved to stand between her sons, and said only that she had buried enough of this family's anger already, and she would not watch either of them bury anything more today. But Marcus was not finished. He reached into his own jacket, the same jacket he had worn to deliver the letter that morning, and produced a second, complete copy of the file Julian believed he had destroyed entirely, documents Marcus had quietly duplicated months earlier without telling his brother, precisely because he never fully trusted Julian's growing hesitation to see the plan through. The evidence Julian believed no longer existed was, in fact, still very much alive, held now in his younger brother's hand, in front of every guest who had come to witness a wedding, and instead found themselves witnessing something else entirely. Guests who had known the Hale family for years sat in stunned silence, some of them only now beginning to understand why Robert Hale's name had so rarely come up at Charleston gatherings over the past decade, why Eleanor had quietly withdrawn from the social circles she once belonged to, why Marcus, unlike his older brother, had never quite managed to build the kind of comfortable adult life Charleston society expected of a Hale son. For many of them, this was the first time the full outline of what the family had endured was spoken aloud in public, and the silence that followed had less to do with scandal than with a slow, uncomfortable recognition of how easily an entire family's suffering can be kept invisible simply by everyone agreeing not to ask. With the second file now visible to everyone in the church, Julian turned to face Vivian directly, no longer speaking to the guests around them, but only to her, as though the 300 witnesses had simply dissolved from the room. He told her, plainly, that everything Marcus had just revealed was true, that the plan had existed, that his early attention toward her had been calculated rather than accidental, and that no apology he offered now could undo the dishonesty those first several months had been built on. But he also told her, with the same plainness, exactly when the plan had stopped being real to him. It was, he said, the night she stayed up until 3 in the morning helping her mother through a health scare without once complaining about her own exhaustion. The same night he realized he no longer wanted anything from the Sinclair name except her, and that whatever debt he believed the world owed his father, he was no longer willing to collect it from the one person who had never had any part in creating it. Vivian, listening to all of this, found herself caught in a grief that had nothing to do with Julian at all. For the first time, she understood that her father's silence about the settlement had not simply been private mourning, but a carefully maintained quiet that had allowed her family to keep a comfortable life while another family lost nearly everything. She did not excuse what Julian and Marcus had planned to do to her, but she could no longer pretend her own father's hands had been clean either, and that reckoning, arriving all at once in front of 300 people, left her steadier than she expected, if only because there was finally nothing left to be surprised by. Julian also admitted, quietly, that he had considered telling her the truth on at least 3 separate occasions in the past year, once the night he proposed, once during a quiet drive back from visiting his mother, and once only weeks earlier, the night he finally decided to burn the file instead of confessing to what it represented. Each time, he said, he had told himself that confessing would only hurt her without changing anything that had already happened, a justification he now recognized, standing at the altar, as the same kind of convenient silence her own father had once relied on, though he stopped short of comparing the two mistakes as equal. When Julian finished speaking, Vivian asked the one question the entire church had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to finally ask out loud. "If I hadn't found that letter," she said, "would you have ever told me the truth at all? Or would I have spent the rest of my life married to a man who let me believe our entire beginning was simply love at first sight?" Julian did not answer immediately, and in the silence that followed, Vivian understood that his hesitation was itself an answer, one neither of them wanted to say plainly in front of 300 witnesses. She turned away from him for a moment, looking instead at Dana, at her own mother, seated in the second row, at Eleanor and Marcus, still standing at the edges of the altar, each of them a piece of a story that had never really belonged to her alone, no matter how much of it had been decided without her knowledge. What Vivian weighed in that long, quiet minute was not simply whether she still loved Julian, because she did, and she suspected she would, for a long time, regardless of what she decided next. What she weighed instead was whether a marriage built on a year of calculated courtship, however genuinely it had evolved since, could ever fully separate itself from its own foundation, or whether some part of every future argument, every quiet Sunday, every ordinary morning together, would always carry the shadow of how it began. She thought, too, about her father, about the version of Walter Sinclair she had spent her whole life believing was simply a grieving man, rather than a man who had allowed someone else's grief to remain unspoken for 15 years, so that hers never had to be. She could not undo what her father's silence had cost the Hale family any more than Julian could undo the calculation behind his own courtship, and standing there, she realized that whatever she decided next would have to be about the future she actually wanted, not a fairy tale ending Charleston society expected to watch. So, Vivian turned back to the guests, all 300 of them, still seated, still waiting, and said the words that would end up quoted in every account of that wedding for years afterward. "There will be no wedding today," she said, her voice steady, carrying easily to the back pews. "But there may still be a marriage, someday, if it's built on something real, and not on anything either of our families owed each other 15 years ago." In the months that followed, Vivian and Julian did not disappear from each other's lives entirely, though they also did not return, at least not immediately, to anything resembling the relationship Charleston society had expected to watch married off that spring. They spoke privately, carefully, away from any audience, working through the parts of their story that could not be resolved in a single afternoon at the altar, testing, slowly, whether trust could actually be rebuilt once its original foundation had been so publicly exposed. Marcus and Eleanor, for their part, began their own slower reckoning, one that had little to do with weddings or settlements and everything to do with 15 years of grief neither of them had ever fully processed. Marcus eventually returned to finish the education he had set aside as a teenager, while Eleanor, for the first time since her husband's death, began speaking openly about Robert Hale, no longer as a wound to be managed quietly, but as a man worth remembering out loud. None of it resolved as neatly as a fairy tale, and the story is better for it. Vivian never fully forgave her father's silence, though she came, eventually, to understand it as the flawed decision of a flawed man rather than a betrayal designed specifically against her. Whether she and Julian ever found their way back to each other in any lasting way remained, for a long time, an open question even to the people closest to them, which may be exactly the point. Some inherited debts take longer than a single wedding day to settle. So here is the question this story leaves you with, the same one Vivian herself had to answer standing at that altar in front of everyone she loved. If you had been in her place, holding a letter like that one, only minutes before your own wedding, would you have stopped the ceremony the way she did, or would you have believed his explanation and walked down the aisle anyway? Let us know what you would have done in the comments below, because every version of this story we hear from you tends to be different, and we would love to hear yours. And if tonight's story kept you holding your breath, wait until you hear what's coming next, because our upcoming story may be even harder to watch unfold. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And thank you, as always, for spending this time with us.